guys, so it is time for a controversial experiments part 2, and this has been so requested from you guys since I mentioned I could do parts 2, 3, 4, 5, and a million. So we're gonna do part 2 today. There's only 3 that I'm gonna be talking about, but first I want to show you guys something that I'm really excited about. Look what came in the mail. I immediately went and bought a frame for it and everything. It's so cute. I'm very excited. It's a very expensive piece of paper that I got here. Why right when I start filming I just made her stop. Okay, so the first experiment we're going to be talking about is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This is actually something I learned in my human sexuality course. It wasn't in psychology at all, and it's not really related to psychology in any way, but it is a very disturbing, controversial experiment that took place. Basically in 1932, the Public Health Service teamed up with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and they wanted to study specifically black men dealing with syphilis, or I guess some didn't have it, but we'll get to that. They wanted to look at the course of syphilis and what happens when it goes untreated, which is where it gets controversial. So in total, there were 600 African-American men that were in this study, and 399 of them had syphilis, and 201 did not. Now this was completely conducted without the informed consent of the participants. They had no idea exactly what they were really studying. They were told that they were looking at and treating bad blood. In exchange for their participation, they were given free meals, free medical treatments, except for syphilis, so just leave that out. And for some reason, this was very promising, burial insurance, that you would for sure be buried when you died. So originally the plan was to have this go on for about 6 months. They just wanted to see what happens to untreated syphilis over time. However, it went on for 40 years. 40 years. It ended in the 1970s, which is somewhat recent, which is scary. And that's because people got wind of what was actually happening, and they were like, you need to be able to give them all the information of what you're doing in this experiment so they can provide informed consent, because they had no idea. They were just very, you know, excited about the free meals and medical treatment and stuff like that, which was actually really good for them at the time, but they had no idea that they actually weren't treating their syphilis. And so a lot of people were dying, especially after 1947 when the drug penicillin became available, and that was used at the time to treat syphilis, and it was very effective, and the researchers were like, no, that's not part of our study, we're not going to give that to them to help them. So tons and tons of men died in this experiment. I don't know what exactly they were trying to see, because, I mean, obviously syphilis will end in death if it's untreated, so I mean, I think we knew that before this experiment. Number 2 is the Minnesota Starvation experiment. This took place in 1944 during World War II, and 36 men voluntarily starved themselves, went through this experiment basically, so the researchers could figure out ways to better treat starvation. Obviously this is controversial because although they were voluntary, there were a lot of effects that happened to these men, and some of their data was, you know, had to be thrown away because they just either broke the rules or just dropped out due to mental reasons. So at this time there was pretty much only anecdotes about starvation and what it felt like, especially during the wartime. So they wanted to see the physiological and psychological effects of starvation on the body, which, I mean, we all can assume is pretty miserable. For me, there's nothing worse than feeling hungry. I'd rather feel thirsty for days than be hungry for like an hour. And the way that they got participants to volunteer for this is they gave this as an alternative to serving combat military service. And a lot of people did not want to do that, so over 200 people applied to be a volunteer in this experiment, and they only selected 36 of them because they had to be good mentally, physically, and had to get along with other people. So the first rule of this experiment was that they were told that they had to lose at least 25% of their original body weight. They had a precursor to this, so for the first 3 months they were eating about 3,200 calories a day, which obviously that's very individual how many calories you need in a day, but that seems like pretty accurate for an average male to possibly gain a little bit of weight. And then they went into a starvation period where they only ate 1,500 calories a day, and they only were able to eat breakfast and lunch, and it was mostly carbs and what was available during the war, so like potatoes, pasta, things like that. So the effects were pretty obvious. They reduced their mental stamina, their physical stamina. They became obsessed with food. They would constantly dream about food, and they would savor the 2 meals that they got a day. The men also reported having apathy and depression. They were also required to do activities. So they had to work 15 hours a week, walk 22 miles a week at least, and participate in educational activities for 25 hours a week. So they weren't just sitting around just seeing if they were going to lose weight. They had to do these activities every week. So after the starvation period was over, they went through a rehabilitation period where they were given 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, and that went on for 3 months. And then after the 3 months, they were able to do whatever they wanted to do. They didn't have calorie restrictions at all. And guess what? They decided that more calories is the best cure for starvation. Did I just blow your mind? That's all they learned from that. So anyway, other than the fact that going through starvation is hard and can cause depression, which, I mean, I think we already knew that based on the anecdotes that was in like journals and diaries and things from the war. So the last one is very disturbing, especially if you are affected strongly by animal abuse, because it is very, very sad. Obviously, the first two experiments were very sad, especially the first one because they were not aware of their situation. Second one, they were volunteers. They knew this experiment. They knew every detail. This one involves animals, which of course is very controversial because animals cannot give consent. This is also before the IRB enacted animal rights and things like that, so keep that in mind. This is not okay today. This took place in 1965. This guy named Seligman wanted to do a study on classical conditioning, which is basically when you associate one thing with another. He would take a dog, he would ring a bell, and then lightly shock it, and he saw that eventually the dog would react to the bell without being shocked, so it would associate the bell to being shocked. And that's kind of like little Albert, as I talked about in the first part of this video, or the first, you know, part 1 of Controversial Experiments video. If you haven't seen, I'll link it, you know, you need to go watch it. Little Albert went through the same thing as far as being afraid of white things. They would put a rabbit in front of him and, you know, make a huge noise and it would scare him. So it's kind of similar, where the dogs would then react to the bell after being shocked so many times. They would expect that shock. So then he decided to put the dog in this little box, and it had 2 sides. One was electrified and one was not. And down the middle there was a little fence that the dog could jump over. He places the dog in the electrified section of the box and issues some light shocks to it, thinking that the dog would then jump over and it would learn to jump into the safe zone. However, what he saw was that the dog would just lay down and give up. Just so sad. It was just giving up on life. It was like, I'm done. And this is because in the first part of the experiment, the dog learned that there was no way to avoid the shocks, and so it just learned to take it, basically, that it couldn't stop it. And so when it came to the other experiment, the second part, it knew that it couldn't avoid the shocks. Like it learned that it would not be able to avoid it regardless if they jumped over or not. And the reason why they knew this is because Seligman also did it to dogs who had not been shocked in the first part of the experiment. So they just put the dog initially in the box with electrified side and not, and shocked it, and those dogs would jump over the fence. It would know to get away from the shocks. So Seligman labeled this as learned helplessness, which he defined as not trying to get out of a negative situation because the past has taught you that you are helpless. Does that sound like anything in humans? Basically, this has been used to explain depression in people, which blows my mind. I think it's fascinating. Obviously, this is a very sad experiment and it can't be recreated, but I think it did teach us a lot as far as learned helplessness, that if we constantly are going through things, like negative things, we just learn to expect the worst, to not plan for the future and not be positive at all, because our past is just constantly telling us that negative things are always going to happen to us no matter what we do. That is all of the experiments I have to teach you guys today. I hope you enjoyed these. Please leave some more experiment suggestions down below. I got some of these from the comments of my last video, which I found really interesting. I had learned about these before, except for the Minnesota one. I'd never heard of that before. So you're teaching me as I'm teaching you, and I think it's really cool. So leave some down below. Also some more psychology requests down below, because it's been like 4 weeks since I filmed one, so I had to do one today. But I need to do one more often, so leave some requests down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.